Welcome, listeners. My name is Kwadwo Sarkodie. I'm a partner here at Mayer Brown in the Construction and Engineering and International Arbitration teams. At Mayer Brown, as well as our experience advising in relation to finance agreements, concession agreements, EPC contracts, and of course with regard to disputes, we also have particular and extensive experience in projects across the African continent. We advise stakeholders at all levels of a project. We cover contentious and non-contentious matters, and our advice and experience extends to the Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone regions of the African continent. Now, it's drawing on this experience, joined by my colleague George Fisher, we'll be looking at some of the issues, risks, and considerations which arise in relation to renewable energy projects in Africa. This webinar will be divided into sections which cover the background and future outlook for the African renewables market, some of the key risks to consider and how best to manage them, considerations with regard to dispute resolution, and of course, please note that you'll see a question box on your screen. We welcome you to submit any questions you might have. We will review these and get back to you with our answers. So looking first at the potential and indeed the need for development of renewable energy in Africa. One of the starkest trends which stands out is population growth, which is projected. Over the next 30 years, the population of the African continent is projected to double. 1 in 2 people added to the world population between today and 2040 will be African. That's more than 500 million people added to the urban population. And 2/3 of the population of sub-Saharan Africa lack access to electricity, and that's currently the lowest in the world. And uniquely in the world, that trend is actually going backwards. Such is the rate of population increase that the number of Africans without access to electricity increases year by year. So electricity is required on a massive scale, and this must be both affordable and with a low carbon impact, to avoid devastating consequences with regard to climate change. So the demand for renewable energy is vast and urgent.
So thank you, Kwaj. As Kwaj mentioned, I'm George Fisher, a senior associate in the same team as Kwadwo, and you've just heard that the demand for renewables in Africa is both vast and urgent, but fortunately, Africa is naturally very well suited to meet that demand. The geography of Africa is such that there are few, if any, areas where renewable energy does not provide a realistic option in meeting that energy demand, given the right investment. So you have clearly geothermal in the tectonically active areas, particularly the Rift Valley, solar pretty much throughout the whole continent, but obviously particularly in the deserts. Many rivers which are well suited to hydro on both a large scale and micro scale, and of course offshore and onshore wind and bioenergy is possible throughout the world. But perhaps more better still is the appetite for this development we see is increasing across the continent and matches, if not exceeds, that seen elsewhere. There are numerous projects on which we'll talk about in a second, but also there's increasing international commitments on the part of African nations, and it was obviously a hugely positive step that I believe all African nations in the run-up to COP21 released intended nationally determined contributions and fully signed up to that agreement, which is obviously very positive news. And the reasons for this enthusiasm are clear, and we list some on this slide. We know that they're not necessarily unique to Africa, but Africa certainly has considerations which make renewables even more attractive. In particular, as Kwadwo mentioned, Africa lags far behind the rest of the world in terms of energy infrastructure. That is obviously a bad thing, but also represents an opportunity to do the so-called leapfrog straight to a diverse, clean energy supply without going through the intermediate step of high-polluting thermal gas and oil type generation. The inherent flexibility of renewables can also help provide that energy supply at a very localized and widespread access level. And in particular, one of the unique issues to Africa is the reliance in remote areas on high-polluting diesel generators. They don't have an electrical grid of any note to tap into, such that both industry and domestic use of energy can be from high-polluting diesel generators. Renewables generally is very easily scalable, allowing power generation to potentially a building-specific level, and then up from that to the use of microgrids and regional grids, and then obviously national grids as well. In addition, renewables generally have high capex, low opex. High capex is potentially a disadvantage for investors, which we will talk about later in this webinar. But once installed, a significant advantage to the country and the consumers is that they've secured a low-cost energy supply and also independence from the wider international fuel markets. Obviously, there's no need for expensive fuel supply contracts when the energy you're using to generate electricity is in all material effects free. And then finally, as we've already noted, Africa has the natural capacity itself to meet all energy demands through its own resources. And this is just a quick infographic that I borrowed from IRENA, which shows that diverse spread of potential sources of renewable energy across the continent. We thought we'd add that in to give a visual demonstration of what we mean.
Thank you, George. Now, to set some of the historical context, we'll look now at some of the projects in the renewable space in Africa over the past 60 to 70 years or so. The tendency has been towards large hydroelectric power projects, and we've seen major dams such as we put on the slide, the Cahora Bassa Dam in Mozambique, which, as the largest hydroelectric power plant in southern Africa, has a capacity in the region of 2,000 megawatts. These obviously tend to feed into a centralized national grid and have been the trend for major projects over that period. However, these sort of projects do run up against limitations. In particular, grids have both limited capacity and limited coverage in many of these countries. Further, the size and the scale of these projects means that where issues are encountered, they can be threatening to the entire energy security of the country in question. An example there is provided by the Kariba Dam, which sits on the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe, which is currently threatened with collapse and requires very immediate and extensive remedial work and close monitoring. That serves to illustrate some of the difficulties and challenges with very large-scale renewable projects. But as we'll discuss as we move through this presentation, there are, of course, options with regards to renewables on a whole range of scales, and going forward, projects in the smaller and medium scale are likely to be more important as providing a part of Africa's energy mix. So we move now to look at some more recent examples. As you can see from the examples on this slide, there's a much more diverse generation mix. So we've seen wind power, solar power, in addition to continued hydropower projects. Now, as George explained, these projects have to compete with thermal power generation, and by their nature are high capex and low opex. This capital-intensive project does present challenges. Generally, high level of debt finance is required at the outset, and that's typically circa 70% of the cost. This has to be provided by commercial banks, multilateral development banks, national development agencies, and/or export credit agencies. And in order to lend, what lenders will require and expect to see is a reliable long-term revenue stream which can service the debt and earn a return over the course of the concession agreement. Therefore, stability and predictability is key. And what this requires is a sophisticated and mature regulatory framework, and that's something which is often lacking in African jurisdictions. Now, this presents one of the key challenges, and as you'll see from our discussion in the slides that follow, underpins many of the obstacles which have been identified, but also obstacles which we feel can be overcome. But the challenges which exist and the scale in the increasing capacity which is required should not be understated. Africa lags the rest of the world in solar power, despite the huge abundance of solar resources which it has. You see on the slide, less than 1% of the global total in solar PV. And when solar projects in South Africa and the Maghreb are excluded, the position is even more stark. As you see, emerging markets saw 107 gigawatts of clean energy come online in 2018. Just 0.87 gigawatts were commissioned in sub-Saharan Africa. And the final quote there, Africa being home to 17% of the world's population accounts for just 4% of global power supply investment. So we'll look at these obstacles and risks, how they can best be addressed, and how they can be matched with the clear demand that there is for investment in African renewable energy.
Thank you, Kwadwo. So yes, in this section we're going to examine some of those risks and issues, but before we do so, we thought it'd be helpful just to have a quick reminder of the basic structure of a project. And on this slide, you can see a very simplified, typical project structure. And I use typical there in inverted commas. I know that there are many variations of a project procurement of this type. It's also worth noting that this isn't necessarily Africa specific, but we thought it would be helpful to have it in mind as we talk about the issues and risks over the coming slides, and it helps show where these issues fit in the life cycle of a project. Of course, there's also many relationships and agreements missing from this diagram, not least direct agreements that lenders tend to demand from most, if not all, stakeholders in a project. And it's also finally important to bear in mind that each stakeholder bears their own unique set of risks in relation to the project. So we review some of these prominent risks in this webinar, but some certainly affect some stakeholders more than others. So what are these more common issues? We show them on this slide. Again, I said this before, it's important to note that these aren't necessarily limited to Africa, nor indeed renewable investments. Although as we go through, we will attempt to explain how these issues materialise more specifically in the African renewables market and how they can be mitigated in that context. Also, while we review these issues separately, many of them are in practice interrelated. For example, funding and off-taker risk can be mitigated by improved scalability and improved incentive regimes. We will also discuss, and you can see point 8 on the slide there, dispute resolution mechanisms in slightly more detail. Now, this isn't just because Kwadwo and I are both primarily dispute lawyers, but also because no matter how much you mitigate against risk, things always go wrong. It is therefore really important that a party knows and feels comfortable that it has adequate recourse to an effective dispute resolution mechanism in respect of any project.
So we look now at one of the key issues and considerations, off-taker risk. Now, we've already touched on the fact that with their very large upfront investment costs and therefore high capex nature, the revenue stream of a project in the African renewable sector is absolutely crucial. This revenue stream is usually governed through a power purchase agreement or PPA with the off-taker, and that must last the duration of the project, so typically 15 to 25 years. Now, we put up here on the slide two main components of the considerations which arise here. First is the creditworthiness of the off-taker, its ability to pay. Now, the off-taker is typically a large national public utility, and there are a number of issues and risks which attach to this. Such utilities are often in the precarious solvency situations. They suffer from bad debts, tariff underpricing, unauthorised connections, and their ability to respond to these and or to alter tariffs to market levels can often be subject to political constraints and considerations. Therefore, the stability of revenue stream, which is key, can potentially be undermined by the status of the off-taker and requires various mitigating steps to be put in place. A further dimension is the policy and political angle. The requirements and quantities of renewable power which are contracted for obviously need to be sustained over the course of the full concession period, and that is subject to political and policy risk. Of course, political priorities may change. Other projects or other means of generation may become more attractive. Decisions or the personnel making those decisions may change, and steps may be taken to reduce tariffs to consumers, perhaps for reasons of political expediency. All of those create a matrix of risk which need to be carefully managed and handled. So how then might these risks most effectively be mitigated? The principal mitigation measure in the African context will be government support. Now, that might take a range of forms. There's the soft support, as it's termed, that is to say, support through granting licenses, through granting tax concessions, and so on. But it's the case often that lenders and stakeholders will seek further and more robust safeguards. Therefore, sovereign guarantees, letters of support, and so on from national governments will often be sought in relation to projects. Equally, multilateral lenders such as the World Bank could provide support by way of insurance or guarantees. But these, as well as national government support in the form of sovereign guarantees, tend to be suited and appropriate in the context of larger projects. And as we've made clear, support for medium-sized and smaller projects also needs to be in place if African renewables projects across the range are to be viable. Other options include the put and call option approach. This is relatively new in the African context, but it has been used effectively in Nigeria in relation to a natural gas project. So while this was a thermal generation project, these principles could equally be applied in relation to renewables. A further approach is also the securitization of revenue streams. Now, this is somewhat more complex in terms of documentation and consultancy fees, and it can serve to reduce the available revenues from the off-taker. But again, offers a means by which off-taker risk can be mitigated.
Fluctuating oil prices is an argument that I have heard put forward for why the development of renewable energy projects will never succeed on the African continent. But what do we mean by it? I think there are two key factors. One is from the investor perspective, that lower oil prices may mean a collapse in market power price. As Kwadwo mentioned, renewable projects depend on a long-term stable revenue stream. A renewable project cannot offset the effect of falling energy prices by way of reduced fuel consumption. Vital, therefore, that there are protections and measures within a project to ensure a relatively constant and profitable revenue stream. But also on a more macro scale, that governments may abandon long-term renewable infrastructure when global oil prices collapse, such as in the recent, and the ongoing COVID crisis, because they begin to favour quick fix, cheap fossil fuels. Now, for investors, the traditional means of mitigating revenue fluctuation is, of course, as Kwadwo again mentioned, to obtain a stable long-term PPA. The governments may not be keen to commit to this. They believe that they can obtain energy from oil and gas, which will be cheaper. And that same process actually operates at a local level too. The challenge is to convince consumers that renewable energy represents a better long-term deal than reliance on, say, diesel generators. The ultimate answer to this, in our view, is technology and the decreasing capex of renewable technology. Solar in particular is increasingly cheap. Panels can be installed relatively quickly and with relatively little expense. And once renewable project capex approaches that of traditional thermal generation, it becomes much easier to convince stakeholders that the overall deal for them is better. And at a government level, there is no denying that there is that temptation of the quick fix. But as we said, any such temptation would be short-sighted. The same volatility that causes low prices can, of course, cause high prices. And by investing in thermal generation now, governments would be gambling that oil and gas prices would stay low for the foreseeable future. And of course, coupled within that, it would be the ongoing dependence on foreign imports, depending on the natural resources available to that state. But beyond that, we also see that the trend and the global movement is towards renewables, and that domestic and international policy will increasingly favour renewable investments. And just this week, we saw the announcement by China, which I think came as a surprise to most observers, that it will strive to be net zero by 2060. And that, in part, also leads to our final point on this slide, which is that to the extent that nations commit to renewable incentives and renewable drives, but then switch to short-term, quick-fix thermal generation, they're putting themselves at risk of claims through investment treaties, which Kwadwo will discuss later in this presentation. So we cover two separate but related issues on this slide: the availability of debt funding and currency risks, such as foreign exchange risk and restrictions on sending funds into and extracting from a jurisdiction. These two issues can make the high initial investment costs prohibitively expensive for investors and lead to the early abandonment of the projects. In terms of financing, it is obvious that lenders inherently want a bankable project, that is, one which is well organised and with risks identified and mitigated against, one which hopefully has comfort from maybe a development bank or an export credit agency, or possibly a government guarantee, and finally the ability to take security and enforce it in that jurisdiction as well. And the involvement of a development fund can also help provide protection in respect of currency risk. For example, the World Bank provides MIGA insurance, that's Multilateral Guarantee Agency, which is part of the World Bank, and that provides various insurance products, not just against political risk, but about more specific currency exchange risks as well. But these commitments from international development funds are limited, as Kwadwo mentioned. Only a certain amount of funding is available for each nation, and this, coupled with smaller projects being unable to afford high due diligence fees charged by lenders, can make it harder for smaller projects to attract development bank and commercial bank financing. There is therefore an inherent favouritism towards larger projects, when, as Kwadwo again mentioned, smaller projects may be the better means of rolling out widespread energy coverage across a territory. The ongoing challenge, therefore, is to increase access to financing for smaller scale projects. And we see the answers to this as being the continued use of concessional loans, i.e. loans provided at a reduced premium, a reduced repayment rate, which allows more profit potentially for the investor. And we note that the same MIGA agency provides the Small Investment Programme, which is a programme designed specifically for small-scale and intermediate projects. We also see an answer as being the increasing standardisation of documentation related to a project, and the increasing familiarity and comfort to lenders and borrowers This will allow potentially for the aggregation of several smaller projects into one larger, centrally funded project, even though the effects of the investment will be felt at a diverse territory range. And we also see the necessity of improving the domestic finance markets, i.e. getting local commercial banks the increased capital such that they can begin to fund some of these projects without the need for multilaterals. And then finally, in terms of just, as I mentioned, that banks are worried about being able to enforce against security, ensuring that the local law and regimes are favourable to lenders such that they can take that security. And of course, all this is linked to scalability, which I now pass to Kwadwo to discuss in more detail.
So looking now at issues of scalability, some of the features to note, and that we've touched on already, are that grid capacity and coverage is often limited. There are large areas of low population, often in between major urban centres, and therefore the installation costs of bringing an existing grid up to a level where it meets the needs of the dramatically rising and urbanising population is a major challenge. And renewables offer a solution here. Renewables offer the prospect of micro-level and medium-sized infrastructure, the prospect of decentralised microgrids, diversification of energy supplies, and they can be combined with storage systems. Now, of course, it's relatively simple, once the microgrid has been established, to later link it up with the main grid. But what a microgrid gives is that flexibility to respond to needs, particularly as urban centres rapidly develop on the African continent. Now, solar power particularly is ideally suited to this sort of off-grid and microgrid operation. But these sort of installations will necessarily be smaller in size, and we've already touched on some of the issues which arise in relation to medium and smaller projects in ensuring that they are bankable and viable. Financing models that exist at present and that have been used more often on the continent are certainly more suited towards larger scale projects. So that gives rise to a debate which is ongoing as to how and where financial support should most effectively be directed. Now, there's the question of whether that should directly subsidise particular projects, whether by being applied towards the feed-in tariff directly in order to make the price of power more affordable, or to support the high capex costs of putting the project in place, which we've already discussed. Other areas include capacity building efforts, that is to say, to build regulatory ability and capacity, and therefore make the investment environment more conducive to the needs of private investors. There's also assistance with contractual and regulatory regimes which are provided to African governments, and George has discussed and mentioned the prospects of guarantees and or insurance, all of which can serve to make projects more bankable. Now, there are a number of initiatives underway to look to standardise contract structures. Now, there's the initiative of the International Solar Alliance, the ISA. There's also the Terawatt initiative. And these are important because the potential to standardise contract structures will give the potential to reduce the upfront cost of smaller schemes, where the legal and consulting fees involved in setting up the contractual structure can be very considerable. Another notable and important development, and indeed one that we here in Mayor Brown have supported and are involved in, is the ALSF, that's the African Legal Support Facility of the African Development Bank. This provides legal and technical assistance to African governments for complex transactions and can serve to increase the capacity of governments to negotiate the complex contractual and financing arrangements necessary to put these renewable energy arrangements in place. Now, the technology and the investor appetite is certainly there So the key scalability challenge is making smaller and medium-sized projects more viable and more bankable in the African context. So we'll look now at a particular scalability initiative. That is the Scaling Solar Initiative of the IFC. Now, this was launched in 2015, and it's intended to provide a one-stop shop approach, helping African governments to mobilise privately funded grid-connected solar projects at competitive tariffs. This provides support by way of a team supervising the process from project preparation right the way through to commissioning. And the benefits include speed, increased bankability, which, as we mentioned before, is crucial, and providing competitive financing and insurance, which provide some of the key support in terms of making the project more viable and competitive. However, there are concerns about this sort of approach. What this effectively entails is subsidy for the project. Now, we mentioned before how often, to make some of these projects viable, subsidy is required. But this does have knock-on effects which do find themselves felt in the wider market. Now, under scaling solar, the sort of indirect subsidies we're talking about are guarantees, our assistance with development costs, our preferential loan rates, etc. And these effectively amount to an indirect subsidy scheme, which can potentially have a distorting effect in the market. What we've seen is how subsidised schemes, or schemes which are supported by international donors and initiatives, can serve to actually outcompete other and otherwise viable private schemes. Bearing in mind, obviously, that these schemes sometimes have to compete for the same grid space on what are often limited national grids and or for the same customer base. Further, schemes which are supported can send an artificial price signal. That's to say, they send unrealistic signals and set unrealistic expectations with regard to schemes which don't have the benefit of subsidy. We've seen across the continent governments is effectively competing to be able to declare the lowest tariff. Now, this can see viable projects which don't have support be abandoned because a government or an off-taker has seen another project, perhaps in that country or indeed elsewhere in the continent, with a lower tariff, which makes the existing project then seem unattractive. All of this can dissuade private investors from taking risks. Now, our view is that long-term, the prospects of the scale and scope of renewable development in Africa, particularly in the solar area, but also in wind, medium-sized hydro, and so on, will be best supported if private investors can be fully engaged and supported. Therefore, the application of support, while welcome, has to be done carefully and with views to its impact on the broader market.
So, incentive regimes, and this builds to some extent on what Kwadwo has been talking about in relation to, in particular, off-taker risk. And there's no denying that the sophistication of incentive regimes in Africa is lag behind those of Europe and elsewhere in the world. And here we use the UK contract for difference regime as an example. And it's important to note that use of contracts for difference is not exclusive to the UK, but it's an example of where they've been used successfully. The contract for difference regime in the UK has been used since 2014, and the next auction is due next year. For those who don't know, the way that it works is that the developer pitches a strike price at which it is willing to sell units of energy to the grid. And then to the extent that the market price dips below that strike price during the operation of the plant, then the state in the UK is represented by the Low Carbon Contracts Company, which is wholly owned by the Department of Bays, will reimburse the developer for that difference. And conversely, if the market price rises above that strike price, then the developer will reimburse some, if not all, of that difference back to the low carbon contracts company. The benefits to the developers is that you get that protection from price fluctuation that we've talked about before, and the ability to offset high initial capex with a guaranteed long-term stable revenue stream. And the benefit for states and consumers is that the strike price is auctioned, which generally drives down prices. In turn, this allows projects to be more bankable because lenders like the guaranteed revenue stream. It encourages innovation, so developers can pitch an attractive strike price while preserving profitability. And all the while, the advantages are, in theory at least, shared with the state and the consumers. But this requires significant comfort and familiarity on the part of the state entities. And this familiarity is potentially lacking in Africa. But without more sophisticated incentive regimes, it is hard to make that project bankable. And the traditional incentives, such as premiums, agreed premiums for set targets, and tax breaks, do not fully mitigate that risk of the fluctuating revenue stream. There is increasing recognition of this in the African market, and efforts to improve available incentive mechanisms. So, for example, the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, the AREI, is attempting to create standardized incentive regimes which can be adopted in the African market. And another example, specific to solar, is the International Solar Alliance, which includes more than half of African nations. And this aims to improve and harmonize regulatory frameworks, create standardized contract models, create a financial mechanism to mitigate risks, and has also launched specific programs for decentralized applications, it's mainly agricultural, mini-grids, and solar rooftops.
We now look at some of the risks and issues around technology. Now, in summary, there is a risk, again, over the course of the lengthy concession period, of either subpar performance and/or defects, which give rise to claims. This can be compounded where there's a single contractor arrangement and/or issues with the transmission systems, and we've already talked about the limitations of grids in some of these countries. Now, these issues are not limited to Africa or to the renewable space, but given that many renewable technologies aren't often at the cutting edge, there is a need to anticipate further developments, to manage issues which may arise, all with a view to maintaining performance over the course of the concession agreement. Now, we've set out a number of potential approaches with regard to managing and handling these risks on the slide. Risk sharing is often important, both as a viable means of mitigating the challenges presented by defect or technological risk, and indeed of combining expertise and know-how. Robust contractual arrangements are extremely important here. What's required is a clear regime with regard to adjustments, deductions, and so on, where defect or unavailability arises. And an important and positive feature of technology is now becoming more tried and tested, particularly in the solar and wind space. Indeed, this can actually pose challenges of its own. With the rapidly falling cost, I would add, of photovoltaic panels and batteries, what we've actually seen in certain African jurisdictions are bidders who are putting it in artificially low bids in the expectation that future price falls will make their project viable. Now, this of course is a highly risky strategy, but it's predicated on the trend over the years which we have seen of falling prices for photovoltaic panels. Now, what this has done in a number of projects is actually led to projects being put on hold or indeed abandoned, because if the cost price which the bidder has banked on has not arrived with sufficient swiftness, that therefore creates an incentive on the bidder to hold back on delivery of the project. For the government or the off-taker, while this is of course a very negative consequence, having invested and taken steps a long way along the road with regard to the project, they may be reluctant to abandon it at that point. And as such, they will have surrendered a significant amount of bargaining power to the bidder. This is therefore an issue which can jeopardize projects and can jeopardize the overall objective of a swift, large-scale rollout of renewables projects in Africa. But the underlying issue, which is that technology is becoming more tried and tested and more affordable with regard to solar panels, which can deliver affordable and scalable solutions in the renewable space, is of course still positive.
Performance testing risk is one which obviously occurs more on the construction side and is perhaps of most concern for contractors. It's an issue that we've also seen come up in practice as well. But what do we mean by it? Well, performance obligations which a contractor may have to fulfill in fulfilling its EPC obligations can often be assessed over several years, and this can mean it is assessed in a period of time after handover has been effected to the concessionaire or developer. So to the extent that the plant therefore doesn't live up to expectations, it may mean that the contractor is subject to liquidated damages, or it may miss out on upside payments. Yet the contractor may not necessarily be responsible for that reduced performance. There are numerous issues which can affect the performance of a plant, which aren't necessarily defects, and in particular deficient O&M performance, operation and maintenance performance. This is an area, of course, which is exacerbated by the technological risk that Kwadwo has just been talking about, where technology may be cutting edge and the O&M contractor engaged to operate the plant may not be familiar with it, which can lead to a reduced performance. However, in our view, this is an area which is perhaps more straightforward to minimise the risk than some of the other issues we have reviewed. But when it's not done effectively, the costs involved can be significant. An obvious way to avoid this is for the EPC contractor itself to also do the operation and maintenance, or at least be part of a JV to do that. In this way, it can control the performance of the plant itself. Further, as specific bespoke O&M contractors in the region get used to install technology and gain experience in the region, the risk should in theory decrease naturally. But at the very least, a contractor should always carefully draft and set out performance obligations and include mechanisms for accounting for issues over which the contractor has no control, but which may ultimately affect performance.
A key theme of the projects and contractual arrangements which we've described so far is a complex network of contracts governing extensive and interlinking obligations between multiple parties over a long period of time. This therefore means that ensuring recourse to a robust dispute resolution mechanism is imperative. Now, in many jurisdictions where these projects may take place, local courts may face limitations. These include case backlogs and potential delays, concerns about lack of experience in dealing with the particular technical and financial issues which arise in the context of renewables and power projects, and or facing a national government or a public utility as a counterpart in local courts, where an international investor or funder may feel that they have conceded home court advantage, as it were. So the solution to this will include a clear and coherent dispute resolution strategy, and one that involves international arbitration. That is to say, ensuring that the arbitration clauses are provided in all agreements, giving careful consideration to the seat of the arbitration and the governing substantive law. A further consideration too is potential, in some cases, for investment treaty protection, which is something we'll be discussing further in a slide in due course. Overall, with multiple interlinked contracts and indeed disputes that may be linked, consideration also needs to be given to the potential of consolidated, concurrent or parallel dispute proceedings. Therefore, either adjudication or arbitration proceedings need to be structured and planned accordingly. There's a clear importance here, given the interlinking nature of both the contracts and therefore potentially the disputes, to avoid conflicting decisions.
As Kwadwo just mentioned, it is important to ensure that adequate dispute resolution mechanisms are in place when things go wrong. So Kwadwo will talk about investment treaty claims, but here on this slide we set out the advantages of international arbitration as the forum for resolving any private contract disputes that materialise in respect of a project, particularly for international parties and investors. And we always advise international arbitration as the means of dispute resolution in relation to such international transactions. And the reason for this is, well, I mean, there's a whole variety of reasons, but the main benefits that we would say of using international arbitration in respect of renewable projects in Africa, and most projects in Africa, are the benefit of obtaining a neutral forum with adjudicators which are experienced in the relevant issues, and of course speed, as Kwadwo mentioned, that the courts can often be slow with a significant backlog of cases. By using arbitration, parties obviously have the flexibility to drive proceedings forward themselves. And finally, the use of the New York Treaty to help enforce any awards in relevant jurisdictions. Most African nations are signatories to the New York Convention, which, for those who don't know, allows the more straightforward, streamlined enforcement of an award in another territory. But coverage is not universal across Africa, and it's important that when investing in a state, it is first checked whether it is actually a signatory to the New York Treaty. You'll have to forgive me this slide because it isn't necessarily specific to renewables or the Africa market, but just as a lawyer who focuses mainly on disputes, I'll have to keep banging this drum because it's a front-end consideration. But it is so important that if parties wish to use arbitration as the dispute resolution mechanism for their projects, that they get the basics right by including suitable, adequate arbitration agreements in the contracts themselves. And on this slide, I just set out some of the key considerations, but we recommend that you always obtain advice about whether an arbitration agreement is fit for purpose or not.
So looking now at some of the more Africa-specific considerations which arise with regard to international arbitration, it can be noted on this slide that the New York Convention, which is something George mentioned earlier, is something that's been signed by the majority of countries on the African continent. However, there are some 17 nations which are yet to sign, and that should need to be considered with regard to issues around enforcement of arbitral awards and or the upholding of arbitration agreements in those countries, which may be more difficult. Overall, arbitration laws are, of course, varied across the continent. However, there has been a trend in recent years of countries to update their arbitration laws in accordance with international best practice. And this has often been based on the UNCITRAL model law, which provides a format for that, and upholds usual best practice with regard to international arbitration in relation to enforcement of awards, upholding of arbitration agreements, and the various associated steps which courts may need to take with regard to supporting international arbitration. As an example of a country which is currently updating its arbitration legislation, Tanzania currently has a bill before Parliament in relation to its arbitration law, and that has chosen as its model the the English Arbitration Act of 1996. In Francophone Africa, an important consideration is the provisions of OHADA, that is the acronym for Organisation for the Harmonisation of Business Law in Africa. And OHADA, which has some 17 members, sets forth a series of uniform acts. Now, they cover areas such as commercial law, securities law, and so on, and importantly, in this context, arbitration. The so-called Uniform Act on Arbitration provides for upholding of arbitration agreements, enforcement of awards, and importantly, makes awards received in one OHADA member state immediately enforceable in all other OHADA member nations. Now, a potential further area of scope for recourse, and one that George has already touched on, is the scope for a claim under an investment treaty. These treaties, which a large number of African nations have signed with multiple nations across the world, provide for protection for an investment, provided it is qualifying and provided that the investor is domiciled in the correct country. Now, there has been a growth in these agreements over the past 20 to 30 years, and it does offer a potential area of recourse in relation to a renewables project if issues arise. However, it does not apply in all circumstances. What is required is an investment treaty between the domicile of the investor and the country where the investment is being made. There also needs to be a qualifying investment, and whether the investment does in fact qualify will depend on the terms of the treaty in question. And what treaties tend to provide are standards with regard to matters such as fair and equitable treatment, full protection and security under the law, compensation in the event of expropriation, and so on. So therefore, if an investor which does qualify can show a breach of one of those terms with regard to an investment which has, for instance, been expropriated by the state where the investment is made, that may offer an effective route of recourse. Now, what needs to be noted is there have been countries on the African continent, and South Africa provides an example, who seem to be moving away from the trends to commit to and maintain in place investment treaties. And we've seen South Africa announce the intention not to renew some of its first generation bilateral investment treaties with European countries, and indeed the treaty between South Africa and the Netherlands has been allowed to lapse. Tanzania too has made statements at least that it plans to bring the resolution of investment disputes back before the national courts as a matter of priority as opposed to being dealt with under the terms of investment treaties. However, Tanzania's investment treaties that it has signed and committed to do still remain in place. However, and importantly, there does not seem to be an overall signal of a trend generally of African countries to move away from the protection offered by investment treaties. And therefore, this protection can remain in place and can be an important measure of additional protection where investments are being made in African countries. And so to conclude, the potential and the need for renewable energy in Africa is enormous. Now, what we hope we've done over the course of this presentation is walk through the identification not only of the risks and obstacles, but of the means by which, by careful structuring of projects, by giving due attention to issues of bankability, scalability, and dispute resolution, these risks and obstacles can effectively be managed. Now, a vast expansion in affordable renewable energy in Africa is absolutely imperative. The good news is that technology is available now. The range of technology available is growing, and the price of those technologies are coming down year by year. Now, the end user demand is certainly there. It's vast, it's increasing. Now, against this background, also need to consider global warming, and the consequences of meeting this huge demand through thermal power alone would be potentially disastrous, not only for Africa, but for the world. That really serves to underline the need for affordable renewable energy in the African context, a need which we feel can certainly be met. We'd like to thank you for listening. We'd like to remind you that we'll be looking at the questions. We hope there have been some stimulating and interesting questions that have been submitted through the course of this. And of course, we'd invite you to contact us going forward if you have any questions or points in relation to any of the matters which we've raised in the course of this presentation. So for now, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed from me, Kwadwo Sarkodie.
And thank you from me, George Fisher.
So thanks to all of you for listening.